Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So today I've decided to do a little bit of a different video. I want to cover the movie Lion, which is based off of Saroo Brierley's book, A Long Way Home. Now this is a story that if you haven't seen the movie and you haven't read the book, this is a story of a child who fell asleep on a train and then ended up thousands of kilometers away from his home in India, and then was adopted by a family in Australia and did not find his home until over 26 years later. And the reason I wanted to cover this movie is because about 2 years ago, I made this video where I had reacted to an episode of Sesame Street, and it involved a Guatemalan adoptee, and they touched on the subject pretty lightly, but it didn't really show like the full experience of the child. It mostly showed it from the mother's point of view and the Muppets' point of view, which are meant to be children that are learning about complex situations like adoption. And this movie, when it came out, it touched me very, very deeply. But since then, a lot has changed about me. I've thought about my adoption journey more, and now I feel like I can actually react to it as an adult adoptee because we see it from his perspective as a child and as an adult, and of course the book as well, which I will get into. So basically for this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself just so we have a bit of an intro, my perspective before I start tackling things, and then I'm going to look at the movie and then the book. So as for me, I think it's really important for me to just state this very, very clearly before I dive into potentially triggering content. I want to clarify a few things. I was adopted from Guatemala as a baby. This adoption was planned. I was immediately sent to live with a foster mother, and she had maybe one or two other babies at the same time as I was there. And I don't remember any of this, obviously, because I came to the US when I was, I think, about 7 months old. So I was a tiny, tiny baby. I don't remember living in Guatemala ever, and I have grown up entirely in the US. So that being said, my experience as an adoptee, even though I am an international adoptee adopted by a white family, it's entirely different than Saroo's. And because of that, my perspective on some of these things, they're probably not going to be the same as his according to his book, according to any interviews you've seen, according to the movie. As a result, I do think it's very important for me to emphasize that both of our perspectives regarding some of the content in this is 100% valid. This is his story, and this is me reacting to his story. So, two different perspectives here. We can only speak on our own experiences. And of course, I do need to state as well that while I'm familiar with the adoption process and with the foster care system from several different backgrounds at this point, I'm a Guatemalan adoptee. Saroo is an Indian adoptee. The systems are different. We're in different generations, and every single system regarding adoption and foster care, there are major flaws in all of them, everywhere you turn. And it's just that some places cover it up better. Some places have different reputations. They all have flaws. And so regarding my personal experience, I just feel like I really have to clarify that before I dive into complex, potentially triggering, and just very emotional content. This is based off of personal experience that has levels of trauma for everybody involved. Every adoptee has some level of trauma, some more intense, some it gets triggered later on, like it did for me. You just don't know. Everybody's experience is going to differentiate. People's experiences and opinions about this topic are going to be completely different, but I just want to be very, very clear about the fact that Saroo's experience is 100% valid. His brother Mantosh's experience as well. And because this is my video, I can only speak for myself. So yeah, I just wanted to put a little bit of kind of a trigger warning out there and a little bit about me and why I feel qualified to talk about this, but also that I'm not diminishing anything that he says if you read the book. Also, I may start crying throughout this talk because it is an emotional subject for me, despite the fact that I'm very comfortable talking about my experience, writing about it. I wrote a short about my adoption experience, but that's just a little bit of a heads up before I jump into this content full through. So now, let me jump into this content full through. I'm going to start with the movie and then move on to the book. I've seen the movie before. It's been a while, but I did see it, I believe, when it came out. And now that I'm older and I've kind of contemplated my own adoption journey a little bit more, I wanted to speak about this film. It's an absolute stunner. I think it was very underrated that year. And there is so much of a story of bravery and so many ends throughout this film. So I'm really excited to get into it. I already mentioned that it's based off of Saroo's book. So I highly recommend checking that out either before or after you watch the movie. It fills in some gaps, gives you more of a perspective. But yeah, 2 minutes into the movie, I was already crying. I've seen the movie before, and knowing what happens and what we start finding out and what he's going to go through, it already made me emotional, and I was pretty much on and off bawling throughout the entire movie. So, oops. Oh well. But yeah, of course, the movie starts with him as a child and that perspective where he grew up in rural India, I believe west-ish India. I'm going to insert a map from his book here. But he lived in poverty with his mother and 2 brothers and sister, but we really only see the older brother and his baby sister in the film. And we see his pretty, strong memories, vivid, but the powerful moments of it, like the water tower that he saw by the train station, which is eventually what helped him find his home when he was on Google Earth, and the Jabelis, which is kind of what triggers him throughout the movie, eventually 20 years, some years later. But yeah, seeing this perspective as a child, that is something that very much differs for me because, again, like, I was a baby. I did not live in Guatemala. I don't have that kind of experience. So seeing it from that kind of zone where he was like 5 years old, I believe, it was different and very fascinating for me to think about, like, what if I did grow up there and then was adopted later for whatever reason? And yeah, it was really beautiful to see. And clearly, even though he goes through all of this, he describes in his book how clearly he remembers stuff before. And of course, it's not a ton because he was 5, but at the same time, like, he describes things in such, like, beautiful and specific descriptions, really, about a lot of things. And I was just like, wow, like, I really, like, you can see how much of an impact and how tightly he held onto it, even if he wasn't really thinking about it up front when he was an adult. And that shows both in the movie and in the book. So I found that very, very interesting. Of course, then he ends up on a train when his brother goes off, and the train starts moving and it does not stop, and he can't get off, and he was over 1,000 kilometers away by the time it stops. And I just want you guys to, like, sit for a minute. India is huge, and back then there was even less organization and stuff like that. India's huge. It has a lot of different languages, and he ended up on a completely different district and zone than where he started, over 1,000 kilometers away, over 1,000 miles away, really. Like, my mom and I were watching the movie together, and my mom said how much he traveled is about more than 1.5 times it takes for us to drive to LA. Because I go to school in Los Angeles and I live in Northern California, and I was just like, geez, because we think California is so huge, but India is really a big country with a lot of diversity in language and culture, religion, like all of that stuff. And he ends up in a pretty dangerous city where the main language, I believe, is Bengali, and he speaks Hindi. So yikes. And eventually he goes through a lot of horrific things and a lot of trauma throughout there, but they specifically say like 15 million people see his picture. 15 million. That's a lot of people, and yet they get absolutely nowhere. They cannot find any trace of his mother. He's so young. Like, clearly he knows what happens to him. He knows he wants to get back, but he doesn't know how to explain to people, I'm lost. I was on a train. I need to get home. I'm not from here. But there's just so much he can do there. Like, there's really not that much he can do. So on top of a language barrier and having no idea, like, he finds out he was mispronouncing his hometown later. So he really has no idea where he is. Like, he knows what happened, but he can't explain it. And so he's basically stuck being a street kid for quite a while. And oh my lord, in the movie, that scene with the street children scared me so badly. And now it scares me even more, just because I was able to really process the gravity of that situation differently from when I first saw it. And it just kind of hits me. This happens everywhere. It's just, we hear about it in countries like India more because it's a bigger population. And there's a lot of diversity in India. So we hear about a lot of different things. And, but really this could happen anywhere. Like, there are kids that go missing everywhere you go. And it's heartbreaking and scarring. And this could have happened to the Guatemalan kids that I grew up with if they ended up in the wrong situations. We really don't. Like, so just seeing that was extremely... like, that's a scene that kind of haunts me a little bit when he's the one that ends up escaping while watching the street kids he was staying with get grabbed. And that was a real memory that he describes in his book, which is just terrifying to think about. And he also talks about, they portrayed it a little bit differently in the movie than he describes in the book, but he gets taken advantage of a few times where, like, somebody will kind of bring him in and be like, okay, like, I'm gonna take care of you, but then later it kind of turns out they might have sinister intentions and he has to make a run for it. And then there were moments in the movie, like, even when he was a child, where he says things like, I'm sorry, Mom. And that really hit me hard because he, you know, of course it's not his fault. He was just a little kid and he made a mistake by getting on that train. But, like, how could he have known what was going to happen there? He was only 5 or so. And that I'm sorry, Mom, really, really stuck with me because he always remembers his mom. Like, they ask him what's his name and he's just like, Mommy. Like, he remembers her always throughout the entire thing. And he ends up in an orphanage, which was also pretty horrific to watch because from the depiction, I mean, he actually describes in the book 2 different places where he ended up, where one was much more positive than the other one. But we see that he ends up in a pretty unstable home for missing children. There's little to no support. Like, yes, they're sheltered, yes, they're fed, but there's still trauma that is inflicted farther as abuse goes on, and some pretty terrible things are hinted at when it comes to things that are happening behind closed doors, should we say. And now, of course, as an adult, I was like, really processing that this happens to people. Children are taken advantage of when they're in vulnerable situations, especially when they're lost and they're like, oh, great, I'll just be a savior. And it's just really terrible. Those scenes really, like I said, bawling on and off throughout the entire film. But then he meets Mrs. Sud, who comes to the orphanage for some children every now and then. And she verbally says, the orphanage does not like me. She is the one that we meet, that I believe really the first person in this film that wants to actually do good for these children. Like, we have had a few good Samaritans, like the man that gets Saroo off the streets in the first place, but she's the first one that's really like, something needs to happen. Something good needs to happen for these children. And by that I mean she's gonna get him out of the orphanage because they find out there's no way they can trace their family. India is such a big country, and they've already, like, millions of people have seen his picture and they have squat. So yeah, it's time for him to consider getting adopted by an Australian family. And when that happens, and I've noticed this in a lot of media that covers adoptees, where when he's adopted, they're immediately like, okay, this is mom and this is dad now. And the way this movie handled it, it kind of makes sense. I mean, these parents don't know his whole backstory. A lot of times, at least in my experience, when adoptions like this happen, especially in traumatic situations, they try to give the parents as much information as they have, or at least something they can go off of, so that they understand this kid comes from trauma. Because again, I was a baby, but they still gave my mom information about my birth family, kept her connection with my foster mother so that we could, communicate through that kind of way. But for him, they were kind of just like, okay, we need to get him out of here. Here's a family that's going to adopt him. And they didn't really give them that much background. And we can kind of tell because they're just like, okay, hi, sweetie, let's go home. I'm mom, he's dad, yay. So kind of as an adult, this has become super triggering for me because I've seen in other movies that I'm not going to name at the moment because that's another video, and I might get in trouble for talking about this movie due to some of the jobs that I've had, but I've seen movies where the parents adopt them and then basically try to erase their entire past. Like, they're just like, okay, you're with me now forget everything that happened to you before you met me. And that's not what it felt like here, because Nicole Kidman's character, Saroo Brierley, she does an amazing job. She really, really does. Like, given the hand that she's dealt, she did an amazing job caring for him and stuff, because one of the first things she tells him in the movie, and hopefully in real life as a result, is that I'll be here to listen. When you want to tell me your story, I will be here to listen. I'm not going to force it out of you, but I'm here. I love that. But the whole suddenly, this is mom and dad. It's like, well, okay, but I have a mom, but I just can't find her. And that's why, like, that line kind of triggered me a little bit, even though clearly there wasn't like malicious intent there like I've seen in other movies, but yeah, that just kind of touched me. And I told my mom multiple times, I think at this point, that one of the things she did right is, yes, I called her mom, but she always was very open about the fact that I had another mom. And I still have another mom. I know my birth mom. I've been in contact with her since I was little. And like, she never tried to erase my identity, and she never tried to erase that person from my life, and my siblings as well. And that's one thing about the movie where I was kind of like, but the book clears things up quite a bit, and I'll get into that later. But I felt like this was a pretty key part. They also end up adopting, I think quite a bit later. Saroo said he was about 10 years old when this happened. They adopt Mantosh, and Mantosh is very, very traumatized, and you can tell because in the movie he pretty much immediately starts with self-harm and having a meltdown, and it's very, very sad. I mean, that scene had me bawling like a baby, just because, like, now that I'm older, I've seen adoptees and foster youth that have gone through different trauma. And in the book, Saroo describes some very horrific things that happened to Mantosh, and it's extremely heartbreaking. So that was very realistic, but also just, it really was a gut punch for me. And then eventually we get to his adulthood in the movie, and it was much longer than I remember, but like about halfway, maybe a little bit less than halfway through the movie, he's now Dev Patel, who is gorgeous in this movie. Don't at me, he was. But that's the only time I'm going to mention this, just to get it off my chest. But as adults, we can kind of see pretty quickly that the two adoptees respond very differently to their situations. One, like Saroo, is very close to his parents. He's always having dinner with them, talking. But Mantosh has kind of been like, I don't like this, and I'm gonna go off on my own. And again, like I said, given their different pasts and how their upbringing was different, and how Saroo's was more about survival, but Mantosh experienced a lot of physical abuse from people, that they respond differently to their trauma. And again, both completely 100% valid feelings. Now, this kind of split in opinion did cause a rift between the two brothers. I know Saroo talks a little bit about this in his book, but it makes sense. I mean, both of them see things differently, and this happens in foster homes too. It happens in adoptive siblings who, one of them might have a better experience than another just because of what they experienced before or during or whatever. But basically, Saroo begins kind of getting these flashbacks when he meets some Indian friends, because there are a lot of Indian people in Australia, and he meets them and eats food with them, and he sees the Jabelis. And that kind of triggers a memory for him. And in that moment, he kind of has a like, oh my God, I'm still so lost. Like, even though he just talks about this in his book, about how the transition for him, it wasn't easy, but he responded well to it for the most part, being with his parents and everything. But this is kind of a moment where he's like, but I'm still lost. I never fully reconnected, because there's still so much of a journey that has not been completed here. And the Indian food that he saw as a child, it triggers him. And this is also where he learns about Google Earth. And on a side note, was this movie an ad for Google Earth or not? Because it should be if it isn't. But regardless, he also kind of is just like deflecting it a little bit, going like, no, leave it alone. And this is a very common stance among adoptees. Some of us just will be like, yeah, I'm adopted. I don't need to elaborate any farther. I mean, one of my friends who was also a Guatemalan adoptee, she doesn't like talking about adoption very much. And I've seen kids that straight up will get triggered if you mention it. So yeah, this is kind of a thing where it's like, ugh. And this also kind of pulls in his girlfriend. It seems like from the book that she handled things very differently in the book, because in the movie, Rooney Mara's character, Lucy, she's kind of like trying to be supportive, but doesn't always go by it. I don't want to say in the right way, but in a way that's actually helpful. Because when they got, like, once he starts his Google Earth search for like where he possibly could have come from, and like trying to find the village that he was born in and everything, they go to dinner with his parents, and she kind of mentions like, yeah, tell them about the search. And he's like, shush, nope. Don't tell her. Which, again, it's a valid stance, because a lot of adoptive parents, they get skeptical about reconnecting their adoptive child to their child to their roots. And this kind of hesitance, I've seen it happen to a lot of adoptees and foster youth, and it really, really causes trauma and identity crises. I'm lucky enough that my mom had us go back and visit my family in Guatemala roughly once a year, maybe every other year or so. And so I was able to see them. I didn't lose that root. It was always okay for me to say like, yeah, I'm from the US, but I'm also Guatemalan. Like, I have roots and I have where I grew up, and both are part of me. And that's something, even with that connection, that I still struggled with. But basically what I'm saying is that because of that uncertainty of whether his parents would really fully support this decision to go looking, because some adoptive parents are just like, oh my God, are they going to want to leave, or is this going to end in heartbreak? And that's kind of where his parents come from. They're worried that it's going to end in heartbreak for him if he tries to search for them, or if he tries to search for his home. And it just, knowing all of that, and only he would know because he grew up with them. But it's different for every adoptee and their relationship with their parents. So I can understand why he was like, I'll tell them when it's right. And the girlfriend kind of forcing it out of him really rubbed me the wrong way. And that's when I kind of realized her character is meant to be somebody that's supportive, clearly wants the best for him, but sometimes like pushes just a little bit too hard. And that's happened to me before too. Like I had a friend Because, like, yes, I said I know my birth family, I know a lot of my birth siblings actually, but I've never met my dad. And when I mentioned, like, I've never met my dad, she was like, "What's your dad's name?" And I said it. And then she started trying to research him for me. And I was like, "Stop it. It's not your business. Don't do that." But she was like, "No, this is important and you need to know." And I was like, "You need to keep your nose out of my business." So that character was a little bit triggering to me, even though I know she obviously meant well, but I was just kind of like, and also we see that Mantosh and Saroo kind of trigger each other as well. His girlfriend Rooney Mara dash Lucy once again kind of tries to intervene, and then Mantosh ends up attacking him quite literally, and it's just a mess. And then there's that scene where he kind of tells her off a little bit on the fact that she has no idea how he's feeling, has no idea what's going on in his life, and that she's not handling things in a great way. Like I said, like, I get that she's trying to be supportive, but as an adult, I was 100% on his side, even though he doesn't handle things perfectly either. Like, it's not an easy situation. It's traumatic all around. But this is why I always urge people who, are trying to help people with their adoption experiences, listen to us, please, because sometimes we don't know what we want and it's hard enough to try to process it. So just listening to us is really helpful, not trying to make decisions for us. And that's why I'm very, very grateful to my mom. Now that I'm kind of an adult, she's backed off a little bit. She tells me, like, you're gonna go back when you feel like it, and only when you feel like it. You don't have to contact your family if you don't want to, because I've had situations where I did contact them, but then things went south. You just never know. So please, please, please just listen to us, hear us out. If we ask for advice, then maybe talk about it, but we already are struggling enough with some of those decisions sometimes, and you just kind of grabbing it and slinging it along, not always helpful. About 99% of the time it's not. So that's just kind of my PSA here. And of course, I do not speak for adoptees, but I'm speaking based on what I've heard from other adoptees and foster youth when I say this. So just PSA. So yeah, at this point, he's had a lot of triggering flashbacks and he's kind of going through it in his head, but he does find roughly where he was born. And finally, he does end up telling his mom and his dad, but we focus on his mom in the movie. He tells her about the search, what eventually happened, and she does support him. And he kind of opens up and says, like, I didn't want you to feel like I was ungrateful. And this is a very common situation because a lot of adoptees go through the experience of their parents being like, you should be grateful. I took you in, I housed you, I fed you, I took you out of that abusive environment. But it's like, or that traumatic environment, or the environment that you could not stay in due to safety reasons, whatever it is. A lot of adoptees go through that experience, whether their parents mean to put them through that or not. Because I always have this thing where I'm like, I need to be so grateful for my mom because she has spoiled me rotten, and so has the rest of my family. And sometimes I feel like I'm such an ungrateful kid, and it's not true, but I still have that kind of so that line really hit it home for me. And he also learns that his mother is not infertile. It's not that she couldn't have her own kids, but she chose to adopt kids in need, kids that would never find a true home. And of course, he's one of thousands, maybe millions of kids that go missing. And they picked to take him. So if, like, it was just, they could have had their own children, but they chose to take a child out of poverty that didn't have the love that they needed. And that's kind of what my mom did too. Like, she wasn't necessarily incapable of having her own kids, but she chose to adopt as a single mother. And I wouldn't have it any other way personally, but that talk was very, very opening to me, something I definitely didn't process the first time I saw it. And then again, we get the beautiful scene where he finally gets back home over 26 years later and he reunites with his mother. So actually, now that I think about it, if it was over 26 years and he was 30 when he made it back home, he really might have only been about 4 years old when he was a child on the streets and landing in an orphanage. Ugh, just hurts. Um, but he says something very interesting, and I'm not gonna deeply cover this beautiful scene because I don't want to start blubbering again. But he says a line that mentions no more dead ends. That was very interesting to me because even in the book, he describes like there were no more questions, but at the same time, I want to learn more about everything. So that line was very interesting the way it was framed that way because, like, you would think I have no dead ends because I actually met my family and still in contact with them and can visit them pretty much any time, and yet there are still so many unanswered questions that I have, but that I kind of choose not to address just because I know they will never be fully answered. I don't know my dad. I've kind of accepted the fact that I never will, and I'm okay with that. But that line kind of just made me think, is there really no dead end though? Like I don't know. That's just something I personally cannot relate to. And then we get to his end letter where he tells his parents, like, this does not change who you are. You are still my mother. You're still my parents. I just found my other mom. And the fact that these two women have met and like graciously appreciated each other is so beautiful. That kind of reminds me of my mom and my birth mom, who, take care of each other. Like, when we're down there, she takes care of her. And when we're away, my mom takes care of my birth mom. And so that relationship, I'm just really glad that it's positive, and that they got to meet at all. And at this point, after the movie, I was crying so much that I had to have a snack, drink some tea, and hug my squishmallow to calm down. But again, there are things in the book that are not covered in the movie at all. And because of that, I was like, let me at least try to read through a little bit of the book. So if my opinion changes a little bit on the movie, because like I already described some things where I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that. But the book did fill in a lot of these gaps. Because as I was reading the book, one of the things he was very clear about is that his parents didn't try to sever his connection with India at all. And that makes me so, so, so happy. He describes how when he first came, they almost only ate Indian food. They made sure to connect him to a couple that spoke Hindi so they could translate and make sure that he, could express things to his parents, if not directly through them. And this wasn't really depicted in the movie, but he was like, I had all these artifacts. My parents gave me a map of India. Like the fact that they kept his culture, his roots in his life, that makes me extremely happy and takes away a lot of my qualms from the movie, which even with those qualms is still absolutely stunning. Like, I love this movie so much. And he also described an instance where he got upset over things that he couldn't quite figure out exactly why it made him so upset. Like, he didn't remember the specific walk to a school in India or something. And he got very upset when he realized, oh my gosh, I don't remember this part of me. And his mom like kind of understood, and he was like, logistically, this doesn't matter. Like, I'm not gonna have to worry about that anymore, but it still hurts. Because that was the first time he realized at 7 years old, I just lost a part of my old identity that was very important to me. And I can definitely relate to that because there are things about Guatemala, about my siblings, that I surely have forgotten that were once very important to me. And so just reading that he felt that way, it's very validating, because a lot of adoptees describe like, this makes me upset, or like this for some reason kind of triggers me a little bit, and they can't quite put together why, but it's because of their past. And in the book, we also learn a lot more about his dad, who was abusive, absentee, kind of just not a great person from what he describes, because the man left his mom. They were practicing different religions, which was already kind of messy. He ended up with a new woman, and he just like didn't come in contact with them again. And his siblings definitely had a very resentful view on this man. can kind of relate because I don't know my dad. And whenever I ask my siblings about it, they just kind of go, he just left. Like, that's basically all that they say. And again, that's why I'm kind of like, I have just kind of given up on that question, but we'll see if anything ever pops up. He also in the book talks more about his very close relationship to Shaquilla, his baby sister, who we don't really hear much about, except in the movie she's mentioned like once and he reunites with her at the end. And his other brother, Kalu, I believe that's his name. I might be mispronouncing it. I apologize. But he was almost completely cut out of the movie because the name is mentioned about once. But the kid, or like the character, the person is not really mentioned in the movie, because I remember I told my mom, like, actually he has two brothers, and she was like, huh? So clearly it wasn't super clear in the movie who Kalu is. And that made me kind of sad because apparently he really took, other than the mom probably, took Saroo's disappearance very, very personally, because then we later found out Guru, his older brother, died that same night, which is just so, so, so devastating that this poor lady lost two of her babies that night. She really did. And that because of that, he kind of became the man of the house because there was no other choice. They had to make the money. And Saroo describes that this, in a way, had a little bit of a silver lining because they were able to save up more money. And this pushed Shaquilla and Kalu into school, which they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So there was that, but there was just still so much hurt. And he describes how Shaquilla, even after just being a baby, like, still remembered him as if like there was a piece of her that was missing when he came back. And yeah, like the movie did portray things a little bit differently. Like, instead of the lady that kind of takes him in for a while, which turns out to be Sinister, he was actually originally saved by a railroad man, according to the book. And it was actually kind of a group of men that he stayed with for a while until he realized, oh, there is something bad going on here, and I don't want to be here finding it out. He also talks more deeply about the actual adoption process, which, like, where he landed in the second place that he stayed at, it took about 4 weeks from there to actually get him matched with a family, which is, he acknowledges in the book that this is practically unheard of today. It takes months, sometimes even years, for babies to get adopted, at least from a pretty standard point. For me, like, my mom met me when I was about 8 weeks old, but she didn't get to take me home, like nothing was completely finalized until I was about 7 months old. So she had to wait that whole time. Like, she knew that she was going to adopt me. And there's even a tape of me when I'm about 8 weeks old. I'm literally laying on this little cow blanket and she's meeting me for the first time. And I'm just like, I don't know where I am right now. And I'm just enjoying myself on my little cow blanket. But like, from there, it was about 5 more months at least until I actually got to come to the US. So he acknowledges this is practically unheard of with the more regulated processes or whatever regarding adoption, especially international adoption, because that's just a whole nother breed. He also kind of describes growing up as an Indian kid with a white family. And this is what really, really interested me, because I, as a Hispanic kid that grew up with a white family, and I'm not like a white Hispanic, I am an indigenous Hispanic, I'm very much a brown Hispanic. And because of that, it's pretty clear that like my family is not my family, and or like not my blood family. And so when people see that, they're kind of like, what is this random brown kid doing with these white people? And he kind of talks about how he wasn't really scarred by racism, which is very, very good. I'm super happy that he didn't have to go through that, but that he did feel a bit ostracized. I mean, he's an Indian kid with a white family, and kids are curious and sometimes have no filter. Kids, you know, sometimes aren't educated on this. I mean, there are plenty of people my age that have no idea what the adoption experiences, and once I explained it to them, they're like, holy crap, you went through that. And yeah, kids are curious, parents are curious. Sometimes it's hard to explain this kind of stuff to kids, and they'll say stuff that is not okay sometimes, even if they don't mean any harm by it. I'm glad that he wasn't affected by it, but he kind of describes his parents being affected by it negatively. And that kind of makes me think about how, like, I don't think that I experienced any of that negativity when I was a little kid, but my mom remembers a very specific instance. Sorry. Wow, my voice is tired, y'all. I've had a long day. But a specific instance where there was a very strange situation with me trying to get into like a Spanish course at an elementary school. And that like the staff members were acting really, really weird around me, made up fake stories about me, and eventually my mom was like, we are not going to this school. Nope. But yeah, so I can kind of see, like, looking back, like, parents are often affected more by some of these racist comments in interracial or transracial adoptions. And that, like, once you grow up, you kind of think about it and look back and go, ooh, that might have not been a great thing to happen to me, but as a kid, I just didn't see it. But now as an adult, I kind of do. Like, when I'm with my mom, people are like, oh, is that your coworker? Or is that your boss? And I'm like, no, she's my mom. And then they go, oh. And I'm just like, okay, I should probably quickly explain before I get the question that I generally get, which is either, is your dad black? Is your dad Asian? Are you mixed? Like, whatever. And I just go, nope, I'm adopted. I'm Guatemalan. Like, I just kind of have gotten used to stating that clearly. Because even though some people actually do kind of look at me and my mom and go, oh, you guys have the same cheekbones. And I'm like, that is a complete coincidence. You don't have to try to find the traits in me. And of course, people don't know. I'm not blaming them, but it's just kind of this awkward feeling that's not ever avoidable when I'm a completely different color than my mom is. And there's no dad in sight because she's a single mom. So it was interesting to hear about his experience in that. And he also talks a little bit about Mantosh experiencing horrific and severe abuse and abandonment. This just piles back onto how adoptees adjust differently depending on their past trauma, how they react differently, and sometimes don't respond well, even if, the parents are trying their best. It's just sometimes that adjustment takes much, much longer. For Mantosh, it took him into his adulthood. And again, that is okay. It's an experience, and it's very heartbreaking to hear that happened to him, and that, like, really some of the things that Saroo mentioned in the book, not even in great detail, but just period, was horrific. And I know that there are thousands, millions of kids that have gone through the same thing that he has. If, this isn't the trauma Olympics, but validation of experience is one of the first major steps that we can take towards healing, at least in my experience from what I've seen as well. He also kind of talks about how his parents didn't take him to visit India because they thought it would be too emotional and traumatic. And again, for me, I was taken back every year. And it's because maybe I didn't have that specific trauma because I don't remember growing up. I never lived long-term in Guatemala at an age where I would remember it, just as a baby in a crib with one other baby. I had a roommate, but other than that, I didn't really remember anything. But for him, he remembers being on the streets. His brother remembers being abused in India. So they do have negative, even though Saroo obviously has the loving memory of his beautiful mother, but clearly there's trauma there. So they were like, yeah, maybe taking the boys back there by force is not a great idea. Like, if they want to go back, let it be their decision. And I also think that that's actually what I would think would be the preferable choice. Like, I don't think that kids should go back unless they want to. But for me, it was a little bit different because I probably never would have gone back had it been up to me, because I don't like traveling. So I would have been like, no, I don't want to go if I hadn't been taken there. But since I was taken there so young and it just became routine, I was like, yeah, we visit my family every other year. And it just was a normal for me. And yeah, it brought up emotions, um, both happy and sad, but it never was traumatic in that sense because it's not like I'm like, oh my God, something terrible happened to me here and I don't want to remember being back in this country. But it's more like, oh, I do have family here and it's good to check in on them. But it's different for them. So I totally understand and I approve, frankly, of the decision that they didn't bring them back. And yeah, he also talks about meeting kids from the same or similar backgrounds as him, also adopted from India. And I love that because I had that a positive experience with that as well. I know a lot of other Guatemalan adoptees, so I knew from a very young age I am not the only one. And even though my friend and I have different viewpoints, she and I can always relate to that, to being Guatemalan adoptees, adopted by white single mothers. We were literally just talking the other day about how being a Hispanic Latina kid among a group of white kids and Latino kids was really rough because we didn't really fit in with either group. We were too brown for the white kids and not Latino enough for the Latino kids, who were predominantly Mexican. So it's like, yes, we're Latino, but I'm not Mexican, I'm Guatemalan. And it just caused this whole yikes. So knowing other Guatemalan adoptees since a very young age was super, super positive for me. And it seems like it was for Saroo as well, knowing other Indian kids who were adopted by Australian parents. So I'm really glad he touched on that. And that's pretty much all of the adoption experience notes that I took. If there's anything else that y'all find in the movie or in the book, if you watch it, please let me know because I'd be happy to elaborate on anything or restate anything in the comments. And again, my experience is 1,000% different than anyone else's experience in this story. And if I missed anything, please feel free to point it out. I love this film. The book is also wonderful. I thank Saroo for sharing his story because that is not easy, but it's very important for people to hear about the experiences that adoptees and foster kids go through so that it becomes more normalized. And of course, people are never going to understand it, but at least they can actually hear about it and maybe learn a little bit more about the topic before they try to tackle it. And again, my experience, I'm speaking based off of what I know and what I've learned. And if people disagree with me, that is 100% okay. Like, adoptee experiences are all different and I validate all of them. I might not agree, but I validate them because I can't tell you how to feel based on your experience. And I love this movie. I really do. I was crying happy and sad tears throughout the entire thing. And I highly recommend that if you haven't watched it in a while or you want to watch it, please do. It's beautiful. Dev Patel did an amazing job. So did Sunny Power. I screwed up his last name. I'm sorry. But the actors in this movie were all wonderful. And yeah, I'm just going to close this off by saying thank you if you've stuck with me for this long. I know this was a lot of content that I just threw at you and it was a little bit of a vent, but I just think it's very important to talk about adoption perspectives, especially international adoptee perspectives, because that's my story. And if there's any other like adoption, I was thinking about looking at another episode of Sesame Street and an episode of Arthur that are about adoption. So if y'all are interested in that, please let me know. Check out my original adoption video, the Sesame Street reaction, where I actually physically reacted to the video and commented on it as it went on. Oh, my voice hurts so bad, but don't mind me. I might not update for a while because I am going to be working and going back to school, but thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to diving into some content soon, more Ninjago, more analysis videos, maybe some more Disney videos, depending on how the Snow White video does, and just, I just am looking forward to having fun with this channel and my casual channel, which I kind of revived a little bit a few weeks ago. So check that out too if you want some dumb edits and opinion videos. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, or if you learned something, or if if you feel something. Please like this video, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!